April 14, 1989, Harlan County, Kentucky. The sign had been nailed to the fence post for 11 days before anyone stopped long enough to read all of it. Most people slowed down, squinted from their truck windows, read the first 4 words, "Orchard for sale," and drove on. The orchard belonged to Dale Perkins, had belonged to his father before him and to his grandfather before that. 3 generations of Perkins men had grown apples and pears on that hillside plot outside Cutter's Creek, and 3 generations had slowly, quietly exhausted every last thing the land had to give. The irrigation lines ran shallow and crooked, half of them cracked through the middle from 2 decades of hard winters. The soil had been pushed past its limit with chemical fertilizers through the 1970s, and now it sat pale and dense, barely capable of holding moisture after a rain. The trees themselves, 64 of them across 4 acres, stood with their bark splitting, their canopies thin and brittle, producing fruit so small and bitter by 1988 that Dale couldn't give it away at the church sale. He was asking $300 for all 4 acres, the trees, the broken irrigation, the exhausted soil, the rusted hand tools in the shed at the back of the property. $300, and he couldn't find a single taker. Raymond Tillis from the county agricultural office stopped by on a Tuesday in late March and told Dale plainly that the land was, in his professional estimation, non-viable. He said the root systems on trees that far gone couldn't be recovered without investment that would dwarf any possible return. He said the topsoil layer was too thin and too depleted for replanting without commercial soil amendment programs that cost more per acre than the land itself was worth. He shook Dale's hand, left his card, and told him the county might be able to help him file for an agricultural loss designation that would reduce his tax burden. Dale thanked him and watched him drive away. The sign stayed on the fence post. 2 men from a property development firm out of Lexington came out the first week of April. They walked the 4 acres together in their clean boots, talked quietly between themselves, and made Dale an offer of $220, less than his asking price, contingent on him clearing the trees himself before transfer. Dale told them he'd think about it. They never called back. By April 14th, Dale Perkins was tired. He was 61 years old, his back had been bad since 1983, and he had a daughter in Cobb who needed help with her rent. He dropped the price to $300, flat, trees and all, and told his neighbor Bud Cassidy at the feed store that he'd take the first $300 anyone put in his hand, no questions, no conditions, and God bless whoever was fool enough to want it. Bud Cassidy told 3 people. Those 3 people told 7 more. By the following Saturday morning, most of Cutter's Creek knew that Dale Perkins was trying to give away a dead orchard for $300, and that nobody in their right mind should touch it. That was the morning Walter Cobb drove out to look at it. Walter was 64 years old, and he had farmed the same 80 acres 3 miles east of Cutter's Creek since 1961. He grew corn and hay primarily, kept a small kitchen garden behind his house, and maintained every piece of equipment he owned with a patience and precision that people in the county had long since stopped trying to understand. His tractor was a 1954 Farmall M that he had rebuilt twice with his own hands. His truck was a 1971 Ford F-100 with rust along the wheel wells, and an engine that ran as clean as the day it left the factory because Walter changed the oil without fail every 2,000 miles, and had never once let it run hot. People in Harlan County respected Walter Cobb in the way that communities sometimes respect someone they have quietly decided not to listen to. He was known for being right about weather. He was known for never losing a crop to disease in 28 years. He was known for saying very little and meaning everything he said. But he was also 64, drove an old truck, and had no interest whatsoever in the kind of modern large-scale operation that the younger farmers in the county were building through the 1980s with new equipment loans and chemical programs and yield maximization consultants from the state university. So people respected him and went right on ignoring him, the way you respect an old clock that keeps perfect time but won't tell you anything you want to hear. Walter had driven past the Perkins orchard a dozen times over the years. He knew its history the way he knew most things in the county, quietly, without making a point of it. He had watched it decline through the late 1970s. He had noticed the color of the leaves each August, the way they turned early and thin, the way the fruit sat small on branches that should have been heavy. He had his own thoughts about why. He kept them to himself because nobody had asked. He parked his F-100 on the gravel shoulder of Route 9 that Saturday morning, climbed out slowly, and stood at the fence for a long time. He did not walk the property immediately. He stood at the fence and looked at it the way a man looks at something he is calculating, not admiring. He looked at the angle of the slope. He looked at where the water would run after a hard rain. He looked at which trees were worst along the low end of the property, where the drainage had always been poor. He crouched down near the fence post and picked up a handful of dirt and held it for a moment, feeling the texture of it, then set it back down carefully. Dale Perkins came out of his house when he saw Walter's truck. They shook hands at the fence. Dale explained unnecessarily that it was in rough shape. Walter nodded. Dale said the irrigation was mostly broken. Walter nodded again. Dale said Raymond Tillis from the county office had told him the soil was non-viable and the trees were too far gone to recover without serious investment. Walter looked at the trees for a moment after that, and then he looked at Dale. "I'll give you $300 for it," Walter said. Dale blinked. "You understand what you're looking at?" "I do," Walter said. Dale took the $300 in cash that afternoon. Walter drove home, ate supper, and went to bed early. The story traveled through Cutter's Creek the way stories always did. Through the co-op on Monday morning, through the feed store by Tuesday noon, through the diner on Wednesday, and through the church parking lot by Sunday. By the end of that first week, there was not a farmer or shopkeeper or county official in the area who had not heard that Walter Cobb had paid $300 for Dale Perkins' dead orchard. The laughter was not mean, that was worth noting. The people of Cutter's Creek were not a cruel community. They were practical people, and practically speaking, what Walter had done made no sense at all, and when something makes no sense, even decent people laugh. Raymond Tillis heard the news at the county office and shook his head slowly. He had written his assessment of that property in plain language, non-viable. He had said it to Dale's face. He could not imagine what Walter Cobb thought he was going to do with 4 acres of dead trees and exhausted soil, and he said so to the 2 people in the office who asked him about it, and those 2 people repeated it to others. Gary Stull, who ran the largest apple operation in the county on 140 acres south of town, heard the story at the co-op and laughed outright. Gary was 41, had taken over his father's farm in 1979, and had spent the decade since expanding aggressively with new dwarf rootstock plantings, drip irrigation systems, and a commercial cold storage facility that cost him more than some houses in the county. He knew orchards. He knew what a depleted orchard looked like, and he knew what it cost to fix one. And $300 for the land was not a bargain. It was a joke. He told 2 other farmers at the co-op that Walter Cobb had always been a little peculiar, and that peculiarity had apparently sharpened with age. The word fool was used. Not always loudly, but it was used. Walter heard some of it. He heard enough of it through the normal channels of a small community that he could have had no doubt about what people were saying. He made no response. He did not explain himself at the feed store. He did not defend his purchase at the co-op. He bought what he needed, nodded when spoken to, and drove back out to his farm. Within a week of the purchase, he began. The first thing Walter did was nothing that anyone watching would have called farming. He spent the first 3 weeks of May simply studying. He walked the 4 acres every morning before the heat came in, moving slowly through the rows of trees, kneeling in the soil, pressing his fingers into the ground at different points across the property. He brought a mason jar on the 3rd day and filled it with soil from 4 different locations. The high end near the fence, the middle of the 2nd row, the low corner where the drainage sat worst, and the flat section near the shed. He took the jar home and spent 2 evenings looking at it in different lights, rubbing samples between his fingers, smelling it. He had learned this from a woman named Edna Fraser, who had farmed 40 acres alone from 1946 to 1971 on the far side of Clover Ridge, after her husband died of a stroke 6 weeks after the war ended. Edna was 70 when Walter first met her in 1962, when he was still young and still willing to listen to anyone who seemed to know something. She had handed him a jar of her own soil once, told him to close his eyes and hold it. She said the soil would tell you what it needed if you were quiet enough to listen. She said most farmers talked too much and touched the ground too little. She said the ones who went broke fastest were always the ones who treated the soil like a machine. Put inputs in, get outputs out, never ask how the machine was feeling. Walter had listened. For 30 years he had listened, long after Edna was gone, long after anyone in the county remembered her name. What the soil on the Perkins orchard told him was this: it was not dead, it was starved. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. He started with cover crops. In late May of 1989 he planted crimson clover and winter rye between every row of trees on the entire 4 acres, not for harvest, not for sale. Simply to begin the work of returning nitrogen to the soil, of loosening the compacted layers, of giving the microorganisms in the ground something to work with again. He seeded it by hand, walking each row slowly with a canvas bag over his shoulder, scattering seed with the same rhythm a man uses when he has nowhere to hurry to. People drove past on Route 9 and saw an old man scattering seed in a dead orchard. In June, he turned to the irrigation. The system Dale Perkins had used was a surface-run gravity line from a catchment tank at the top of the property, fed by a spring that still ran clean and cold from the ridge above. The lines themselves were the problem: old aluminum pipe, crimped and cracked in a dozen places, poorly sloped, pooling in the low sections and running dry in the high ones. Walter pulled every section of line by hand over the course of 3 weeks, working in the mornings before the heat. He relayed the lines himself, re-sloping them along new grades he had calculated by eye over those first weeks of walking the property. He replaced the cracked sections with new aluminum he bought in 10-foot lengths from the hardware store in town, soldering the joints himself with a propane torch in the shed at the back of the property. Nobody came to watch, nobody asked how it was going. The cover crops grew green and thick between the grey rows of trees, and Walter worked in the mornings, and the summer passed. In the fall of 1989, he began work on the trees themselves. He did not start with all 64, he started with 12, the ones on the upper section of the property, where the drainage was best and the soil had degraded least. He spent October studying their branch structure, tracing the lines of healthy wood from the base upward, identifying which branches still carried viable cambium beneath their cracked bark. On some trees, the answer was almost nothing. On others, it was more than it looked. He grafted through October and November, working in the cold mornings with a grafting knife he had sharpened to a precise edge on a whetstone he had owned since 1958. He cut scions from a healthy apple tree on his own property, on a variety his father had planted in 1939 that had never once failed him, and grafted them onto the old root structures of the Perkins trees with the patience of a man who understood that he would not see the results for 2 years, maybe 3. He wrapped each graft in budding rubber and moved to the next one. By the end of November, he had grafted 31 trees. He covered the remaining 33 through the winter with a program of deep mulching, applying 6 inches of wood chip mulch around each base to hold soil temperature, reduce moisture loss, and begin the slow work of adding organic matter back into the depleted topsoil layer. The cover crops died back with the frost and became the first natural amendment the soil had received in 20 years. 1990 passed, 1991 passed. Walter worked the Cobb farm in the mornings and drove to the orchard in the afternoons, 3 or 4 times a week. He expanded the cover crop rotation to include hairy vetch and buckwheat, both of which he turned back into the soil in late summer of each year as green manure. He planted comfrey along the fence lines, whose deep roots broke up the hardpan beneath the topsoil and whose leaves became mulch. He added a second catchment tank at the midpoint of the property, fed from the same spring, which allowed him to create 2 independent irrigation zones with better pressure balance across the slope. He spoke about none of this at the co-op or the feed store. By 1991, people had largely stopped discussing Walter Cobb's orchard. The joke had run its course. He was an old man who had wasted $300 on a dead piece of land, and that was the end of it. Gary Stull had nearly forgotten about it entirely, occupied as he was with a new controlled atmosphere storage expansion that his bank had approved in the spring. In the spring of 1992, 3 years after the purchase, 8 of the 12 grafted trees in the upper section put out new growth that was visibly different from anything the orchard had shown in years. The leaves came in wide and dark green, the color of genuine health, carried on new branches that had grown 6 to 8 inches from the graft unions in the prior season. Walter stood among them on a morning in late April and looked at each one carefully and allowed himself one small nod before moving on to the next row. He said nothing to anyone in town. By 1993, the cover crop rotations had visibly changed the soil texture in the treated rows. Walter could push his fingers into the ground now without effort in places that had been dense and pale 4 years earlier. The color of the soil had shifted, darker, richer, with the slightly sweet smell of active biological life that Edna Fraser had taught him to recognize before he ever understood the science behind it. He began finding earthworms in the upper sections in the spring of 1993, which was a fact he noted in the small spiral notebook he had kept since the beginning, and which meant more to him than any yield figure could have. He grafted the remaining 33 trees through 1993 and 1994, completing the full renovation of all 64 trees by the end of the 4th year. The variety he had used from his own property, a regional heirloom his father had simply called the Cobb Red, produced a medium-sized apple with dense flesh and a sharp, complex flavor that stored exceptionally well without refrigeration and ripened in stages through September and October rather than all at once, which spread the harvest window and reduced spoilage. In the fall of 1994, the 5th year, the 12 oldest grafted trees in the upper section produced their first meaningful crop. Not large, 40 to 50 pounds per tree against the 200 or more that a mature, healthy tree should carry, but the fruit was clean, firm, and properly sized. Walter picked it himself, packed it into wooden crates, and sold it at the Cutters Creek Farmers Market on 3 consecutive Saturdays in October. It sold out each time before noon. He said nothing remarkable about this to anyone. When people asked where the apples came from, he told them the orchard on Route 9. Most of them had forgotten there was an orchard on Route 9. The years from 1995 to 1998 were the middle years, the ones that confirmed what Walter already knew and that no one else was watching closely enough to see. The grafted trees matured on schedule. The soil across the full 4 acres had reached a condition that Walter measured not by any commercial standard, but by the consistent feel and smell of it under his hands each spring. Loose, dark, full of the small biological activity that indicated a functioning ecosystem rather than a chemical substrate. The irrigation system he had relayed ran clean and balanced, delivering consistent moisture from the spring-fed tanks to both zones without the pooling and dry running that had wasted water and stressed root systems under the Perkins method. He added bees in 1996. 2 hives set at the northeast corner of the property. He did not keep bees commercially. He kept them because the orchard needed them, and because the nearest commercial operation was 3 miles away, and because Walter had learned from 35 years of farming that nothing in agriculture operates in isolation, and that every problem with a crop is eventually a question about the whole system surrounding the crop. By 1997, the full 64 trees were in productive condition. Not peak production, that would take another 2 years, but genuine, reliable, meaningful production. Walter harvested just over 4,000 pounds of apples from the orchard that fall. He sold them at the farmer's market and to 2 small grocers in town. He began keeping a second notebook that year, separate from the first, recording yields by tree, by row, and by week of harvest. Gary Stull heard, through the feed store, that Walter Cobb was selling apples from that old Perkins place. He heard it twice from 2 different people, and each time he noted it without much reaction. 4,000 pounds was nothing. His operation was moving 60,000 pounds in a good year. He wished Walter well and moved on. The fall of 1999, the 10th year, changed the ledger. Walter harvested 11,300 pounds from the 4-acre orchard that October. The trees had reached full productive maturity across all 4 acres. The Cobb Red variety, on the restored root systems and the rebuilt soil, produced with a consistency and density that Walter had only seen on the best-tended orchards in the state. The fruit sized beautifully, stored well, and, because it ripened across a 6-week window rather than all at once, allowed him to supply the farmer's market and his 2 grocery accounts continuously through September and October without overwhelming his storage capacity. He added 4 new grocery accounts that fall. He could have added more. He held back because he wanted to expand into the adjacent plot, a 2-acre parcel that bordered the orchard to the north, owned by a retired couple who had stopped using it. Before he committed to volume, he couldn't yet consistently supply. He leased the 2-acre parcel in January of 2000 for $40 a month. He began the soil restoration process there immediately, using the same cover crop rotation he had used on the original 4 acres, starting with the same patience, the same timeline, the same refusal to rush what could not be rushed. Spring of 2000, Cutters Creek, Kentucky. Raymond Tillis had retired from the county agricultural office in 1997 and now spent his mornings at the diner on Main Street with a group of retired men who talked about farming the way men talk about things they no longer do. He had heard gradually through the years that Walter Cobb had done something with the Perkins orchard. He had heard the numbers in pieces, 4,000 pounds, then 7,000, then 11,000, and each number had landed somewhere in his chest with a quiet, specific weight that he could not quite name. He drove out to Route 9 on a morning in April of 2000, parked on the gravel shoulder, and looked through the fence at the orchard. The trees stood full, and even in rows that were clean and well spaced. The soil between them was dark and friable, covered with the turned-under remains of the previous season's cover crop. The irrigation lines ran true along the slope, new and properly graded. The canopies were wide and dense, the branch structure of healthy, well-managed trees that had been given exactly what they needed for exactly as long as it took. Raymond sat in his car for several minutes after looking at it. Then he drove to Walter Cobb's farm. Walter was in his equipment shed when Raymond pulled in. He came out, wiped his hands on a rag, and shook Raymond's hand. Raymond said he had driven out to the orchard. Walter nodded. Raymond said it looked different than he remembered. Walter said it had been 11 years. Raymond looked at the ground for a moment and then looked up. I told Dale Perkins that land was non-viable, Raymond said. I put it in writing. Walter looked at him. I was wrong, Raymond said. I want you to know I understand that. Walter was quiet for a moment. He folded the rag and set it on the workbench behind him. You were reading what the land looked like, he said. That's not the same as reading what it needed. He picked up the wrench he had set down when Raymond drove in. The land wasn't dead. It was starved. Starved things look the same as dead things if you're only looking at the surface. Raymond nodded slowly. The county office, Walter said, not unkindly, was always looking at what could be done quickly. There's nothing wrong with that for most things. This wasn't a quick problem. He offered Raymond a cup of coffee. Raymond stayed for 40 minutes. He asked questions, and Walter answered them plainly, describing the cover crop rotation, the grafting program, the irrigation redesign, the bee introduction, the soil development timeline. He described it the way a man describes a job he has done well. Not with pride exactly, but with the quiet precision of someone who knows every step of what he accomplished and why each step mattered. Raymond drove home and sat at his kitchen table for a long time. He told his wife that evening that he had gone out to look at the Perkins orchard. She asked what it looked like now. He thought for a moment. He said it looked like what it would have looked like if someone had treated it right from the beginning. The fall of 2000, the 11th year, the Cobb orchard, as people had quietly begun calling it, produced 17,400 pounds of apples from the original 4 acres, with the newly restored 2-acre parcel adding its first modest but genuine contribution, an additional £1,100, £18,500 total. Walter had expanded his sales network the previous spring, working methodically through the same channels he always used: conversation at the farmer's market, a phone call to a buyer, a handshake on terms, a first delivery that showed up exactly when he said it would and contained exactly what he had promised. He had added accounts in 3 neighboring counties, Harlan, Leslie, and Knox, in 1999 and early 2000, supplying independent grocers, 2 small regional co-ops, and a school district food program that a buyer in Leslie County had connected him with. By October of 2000, the Cobb red apple from the orchard on Route 9 was moving into grocery stores and co-ops across 3 counties. The volume was not enormous by commercial standards, but it was consistent, reliable, and, because of the extended harvest window, available longer than most regional apple varieties. 3 counties, thousands of families, all of them eating fruit from 4 acres of land that Raymond Tillis had declared non-viable in 1989, that Gary Stull had laughed about at the co-op, that every practical person in Cutter's Creek had agreed was a foolish purchase for $300. Gary Stull heard the 3-county figure in November of 2000. He heard it from a buyer who had approached him about increasing his volume and mentioned, almost in passing, that he was also working with a smaller operation out of Cutter's Creek, whose apple variety was getting very strong repeat interest from retailers. Gary asked the name. The buyer said Cobb. Cobb Orchard, Route 9. Gary set down his coffee. He had driven past that orchard 100 times in 11 years. He had laughed at the counter of the co-op in 1989. He had told 2 other farmers plainly that Walter Cobb had always been a little peculiar. He sat with that for a moment. He drove out to Route 9 the following week on a grey November morning after the harvest was done and looked at the orchard through the fence. The trees stood bare but strong against the sky, their branch structure clean and wide, their spacing even across soil that was dark and rested, and ready for another year. He stood at the fence for longer than he expected to. He called Walter that evening. Walter answered on the 3rd ring. Gary explained who he was, unnecessarily since Walter knew, and said he had driven out to look at the orchard and wanted to ask about the grafting program, if Walter was willing to talk about it. There was a pause. "Come out to the farm Saturday morning," Walter said. "I'll show you the trees I took the scions from." Gary came on Saturday. They walked Walter's original farm together, and Walter showed him the old Cobb red tree his father had planted in 1939, now 61 years old and still producing with extraordinary health on a root system that had never been pushed past its limits. He showed Gary the soil under it, the same deep, dark, living soil he had worked to recreate on the Perkins property over 11 years. He explained the cover crop rotation without being asked. He explained the grafting technique. He answered every question Gary asked with the same plain patience he had always used, and Gary listened with the full attention of a man who had spent 20 years believing he already knew what there was to know. Before Gary left, he stopped at his truck and stood there a moment. "I said some things at the co-op back in '89, Gary said, "about your buying that land." Walter waited. "I was wrong about it," Gary said. "About all of it. I want you to know I understand that." Walter looked at him for a moment. "You were working with what you knew," he said. "Most men are. The question is whether you keep working with only that." Gary nodded. He shook Walter's hand and drove back toward town. On the road home, Gary Stull passed the orchard on Route 9. He slowed down without deciding to. He looked at the 4 acres through his truck window, bare November trees, good soil, clean irrigation lines running true along the slope. 11 years ago, it had been a dead orchard that nobody wanted. $300 had bought it. 11 years of patience, of cover crops and grafting knives and early mornings and a refusal to ask the land for more than it was ready to give had turned it into something that fed 3 counties. He sat on the gravel shoulder for a long time, engine running. That winter, Gary Stull ordered a soil test on his 140-acre operation, the first comprehensive biological soil test he had ever run. As opposed to the standard nutrient content panels his agronomist used, the results took 3 weeks. He read them at the kitchen table on a January evening, and then he called the agronomist and asked about cover crop options for the coming spring. The agronomist, who had never heard Gary Stull ask about cover crops before, asked what had changed. Gary looked out his kitchen window at his own orchard, dormant in the January dark. "I drove past the Cobb place," he said. Walter Cobb farmed through 2000 and into the years beyond it the same way he had always farmed, steadily, quietly, with his hands in the soil and his mind on the long timeline that most people found impossible to think in. He expanded the leased parcels restoration on schedule. He added a 3rd notebook in 2001, when the volume made the 2nd one insufficient. He changed the oil in the F100 every 2,000 miles. He did not attend any ceremony. He did not give any interviews. A woman from the Leslie County Agricultural Extension Office called him in 2001 and asked if he would consider speaking at a regional growers' conference about his soil restoration methods. He told her he would think about it. He called her back 2 days later and said he would come, but that he was not a speaker and would prefer to simply walk people through the orchard and answer questions. She said that was fine. 43 farmers from 3 counties walked the Cobb orchard on a Saturday in October of 2001. Walter walked with them, unhurried, stopping at each row to explain what had been done and why. He brought the first notebook, the one from 1989, and showed people the early entries, the soil observations, the graft records, the cover crop notes in his small, tight handwriting. He showed them the 2nd and 3rd notebooks. He showed them the tree his father had planted in 1939, still producing 62 years later. Most of the farmers asked questions. Some of them took notes. A few of them were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are recalculating something they have always believed. On the drive home that afternoon, a young farmer from Knox County, 26 years old, 3 years into his first orchard, pulled over at the gas station in Cutter's Creek and sat in his truck, writing everything he could remember in a notebook he found in his glove box. He wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. He had driven to the orchard that morning, skeptical of what an old farmer from a small county could tell him. He drove home, knowing he had just been shown 11 years of proof that the thing he most needed to learn was the one thing nobody in his agricultural program had ever taught him, that some land does not need to be fixed quickly. It needs to be given back what was taken from it, slowly, in the order it was taken, and with the patience to wait for it to decide it is ready. The orchard on Route 9 was still there. The trees were still producing, the soil was still dark and living and ready for another year. Walter Cobb was still driving the F100 out there in the mornings, still walking the rows, still kneeling in the dirt with his hands open and his mind quiet. He had bought a dying orchard for $300, and everyone had called him a fool, and he had simply gone to work. Some knowledge does not announce itself, it just keeps being right while the world catches up.